Welcome back, listeners, to another enlightening episode of The Way of Hermes. I'm Jake, and with me, as always, is my co-host Emily. Today, we're diving deep into the fascinating world of Hermeticism.
That's right, Jake. We've got a lot to unpack about this ancient spiritual and philosophical tradition. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is Hermeticism, or as it's sometimes called, the Way of Hermes?
Great question, Emily. Hermeticism is a complex and multifaceted movement that originated in Hellenistic Egypt. It's a blend of religious, spiritual, philosophical, and magical elements attributed to the mythical figure Hermēs Trismegistos.
Interesting. So it's not just one thing, but a combination of different aspects. Can you tell us a bit more about its origins?
Absolutely. The movement was initiated by Egyptian priests who were working within a Hellenistic context. They produced a series of texts that became the foundation of Hermetic thought. However, it's crucial to note that the term Hermeticism itself is relatively modern.
Oh, really? When did people start using that term?
Surprisingly, it wasn't used in the classical period at all. The term Hermeticism only came into use during the Renaissance, particularly in Italy, with the rediscovery of the Corpus Hermeticum. Before that, it was simply referred to as Egyptian.
That's fascinating. It seems like there's been quite an evolution in how we understand and talk about these ideas. I've also heard terms like Hermetism used. Is there a difference?
You're right to pick up on that, Emily. Some scholars do make distinctions between terms like the Way of Hermes, Hermeticism, and Hermetism. It's not universally agreed upon, but generally, the Way of Hermes refers to the authentic tradition practiced in antiquity.
And what about Hermetism?
Hermetism is often used to specifically describe the classical era of this tradition, predating texts like the Emerald Tablet. Hermeticism, on the other hand, is a broader term that encompasses both classical and post-classical developments.
I see. It sounds like these terms can be quite nuanced. Is there a concise definition we can offer our listeners for Hermetism?
Christian Bull, in his book The Tradition of Hermēs Trismegistos, offers a good one. He defines Hermetism as a designation for the ritual tradition of the Way of Hermes, essentially the way of immortality described by Hermēs Trismegistos in the texts attributed to him from the classical period.
That's helpful, Jake. But I can't help but notice that you mentioned the term Hermeticism being problematic earlier. Can you elaborate on that?
The term Hermeticism has become somewhat of an umbrella term over the years, especially due to influences from the Renaissance and early 20th century scholars. It's often used vaguely to encompass beliefs in ancient wisdom from the Orient, transmitted through Platonic tradition, as well as fascination with traditional arts like astrology, alchemy, and natural magic.
That does sound quite broad. Why has it become so expansive?
Well, it's partly due to misunderstandings by scholars like Francis Yates, but it's also a result of the long and complex history of Hermēs Trismegistos' influence across different cultures over 2 millennia. The word Hermetic has come to be used for almost anything mysterious and ancient.
I can see how that could lead to confusion. So how can we understand what authentic Hermeticism is?
Great question, Emily. The key is to focus on the Hermetic texts themselves. They're the beating heart and living root of Hermeticism. Just as Christianity is based on the teachings of Christ, Hermeticism is based on the teachings and practices of Hermēs Trismegistos.
That makes sense. So would you say that anything that agrees with these texts can be considered Hermetic?
Yes, to an extent. If something agrees with the Hermetic texts both in means and goals, that is, if it reaches the same philosophical or religious conclusions using the same methods, we can consider it Hermetic, or at least say it can be aptly used in a Hermetic context.
Interesting. And what about ideas or practices that don't directly agree with the texts?
Well, if something doesn't agree but doesn't disagree either, it can potentially be adopted or used by Hermeticism for Hermetic ends. However, if something outright disagrees with the texts, it's not Hermetic, though with enough effort, it might be adapted for Hermetic purposes.
This is all fascinating, Jake. I'm sure our listeners are curious about specific examples. For instance, what about the Kybalion? I've heard it mentioned in relation to Hermeticism before.
Ah, the Kybalion. That's a great example, Emily. Despite its popularity in some circles, the Kybalion is actually not considered authentically Hermetic by scholars. Nicholas Chappell's essay, The Kybalion's New Clothes, does an excellent job of breaking down the stark differences between the Kybalion and genuine Hermetic texts.
Really? That's surprising. It sounds like there's a lot of nuance when it comes to determining what is and isn't truly Hermetic. This is all incredibly intriguing, Jake. I'm sure our listeners are eager to learn more. Do you have any recommendations for those who want to dive deeper into authentic Hermeticism?
For those who want to understand the core of Hermeticism, or more accurately, Hermetism, there are several excellent scholarly works I'd recommend. Garth Fowden's The Egyptian Hermes is a great place to start.
That sounds like a solid foundation. Any other books you'd suggest?
Definitely. Kevin Van Bledel's The Arabic Hermes offers valuable insights into the tradition's development in the Islamic world. Christian Bull's The Tradition of Hermēs Trismegistos is another excellent resource, along with his many scholarly articles on the subject.
These all sound like fantastic resources, Jake. Is there one more you'd like to mention before we wrap up this segment?
Yes, I'd highly recommend Wouter J. Hanegraaff's Hermetic Spirituality and the Historical Imagination, Altered States of Knowledge in Late Antiquity. It provides a deep dive into the historical context and spiritual aspects of Hermeticism.
Wonderful suggestions, Jake. I'm sure our listeners will find these resources invaluable in their exploration of authentic Hermeticism.
Now, let's shift our focus to a specific text that's often associated with Hermeticism, but actually isn't considered authentically Hermetic, the Kybalion.
That's right, Jake. We briefly touched on this earlier, but I think our listeners would benefit from a more in-depth explanation. Can you tell us more about why the Kybalion isn't considered truly Hermetic?
Nicholas Chappell's essay, The Kybalion's New Clothes, provides an excellent analysis of this. The key issue is that the Kybalion, despite its popularity, doesn't actually originate from any authentic Hermetic text.
That's surprising. So what are the main differences between the Kybalion and genuine Hermetic teachings?
Well, Chappell's essay points out that the Kybalion's teachings either completely miss the mark when it comes to authentic Hermetic concepts, or in some cases, directly contradict them. It's not just a matter of interpretation. The core ideas are fundamentally different.
I see. It sounds like this could be quite misleading for people who are trying to learn about Hermeticism. Are there any specific examples you can share?
While we don't have time to go into all the details, one key difference is in how the Kybalion views the nature of reality compared to authentic Hermetic texts. The Kybalion presents a more mental, almost solipsistic view of the universe, whereas true Hermetic teachings have a more complex cosmology.
That's fascinating, Jake. It really highlights the importance of going back to the original sources when studying these traditions. Now let's move on to another interesting topic, the Golden Dawn's magical system. How does this relate to Hermeticism?
The Golden Dawn system is an interesting case because while it's not authentic Hermeticism in the strictest sense, it does draw significant inspiration from Hermetic concepts.
Can you elaborate on that? How does the Golden Dawn incorporate Hermetic ideas?
Certainly. Sheik and Tabitha Cicero's book, The Essential Golden Dawn, An Introduction to High Magic, provides a good explanation. They argue that while the Golden Dawn system incorporates various magical and spiritual traditions, its approach and goals are heavily influenced by Hermetic notions of salvation, divinity, and cosmology.
That's interesting. So it's more of an adaptation or interpretation of Hermetic ideas rather than a direct continuation.
Exactly. The Golden Dawn system blends Hermetic concepts with other influences like Kabbalah, Rosicrucianism, and Freemasonry. It's part of a broader evolution of magical practices that draw on the Greco-Egyptian magical literature associated with Hermeticism.
Sounds like there's a complex interplay between authentic Hermetic teachings and later magical traditions. How can our listeners distinguish between these different strands of thought?
That's a great point, Emily. The key is to always go back to the original Hermetic texts. While later traditions like the Golden Dawn can offer valuable insights, understanding the core Hermetic teachings provides a crucial foundation for discerning what is and isn't authentically Hermetic.
Thank you, Jake. This discussion really highlights the complexity of Hermeticism and its influence on later magical and spiritual traditions. It's clear that there's a lot more to explore in this fascinating field.
Absolutely, Emily. This complexity is what makes the study of Hermeticism so fascinating. Now let's dive a bit deeper into how we can define authentic Hermeticism based on the original texts.
That sounds great, Jake. I'm sure our listeners are eager to understand how to distinguish authentic Hermetic ideas from later interpretations or adaptations.
You're right, Emily. The key to understanding authentic Hermeticism lies in the original Hermetic texts themselves. These texts form the foundation of Hermetic thought and practice. Let's take the concept of personal transformation, which is central to Hermeticism. An idea or practice that aims at spiritual evolution through understanding the nature of reality would align well with Hermetic teachings. On the other hand, a purely materialistic philosophy would contradict Hermetic principles and wouldn't be considered Hermetic.
That's a helpful example, Jake. It seems like understanding authentic Hermeticism requires a deep dive into these original texts. Are there any specific texts you'd recommend for our listeners who want to explore further?
Absolutely, Emily. The Corpus Hermeticum is a great starting point. It's a collection of Greek texts that form the core of Hermetic philosophy.
Is there anything else our listeners should keep in mind as they explore these texts?
Yes, Emily. It's important to remember that these texts were written in a specific historical and cultural context. Understanding that context can provide valuable insights into the meanings and intentions behind the teachings.
That's a great point, Jake. It seems like studying Hermeticism is as much about historical and cultural understanding as it is about philosophy and spirituality.
Exactly, Emily. It's a multifaceted field of study that requires a holistic approach. By understanding the original texts in their proper context, we can better discern what is authentically Hermetic and how later traditions have built upon or diverged from these foundational ideas.
Jake, this discussion about authentic Hermeticism and its texts is fascinating. I'm curious, how has the academic study of Hermeticism evolved over the years?
The academic study of Hermeticism has undergone significant changes, especially in recent decades. Scholars have been working to separate the authentic ancient traditions from later interpretations and additions.
That sounds like quite a challenge. Are there any key figures or works that have been particularly influential in this academic shift?
Absolutely. One scholar who's made significant contributions is Walter J. Hanegraaff. His work has been instrumental in clarifying the boundaries of what we can consider authentic Hermeticism.
Can you tell us more about Hanegraaff's perspective on Hermeticism?
Certainly. Hanegraaff has argued that the term Hermeticism has become problematically broad. Interestingly, Hanegraaff actually advises that we drop the term Hermeticism entirely due to its vagueness and potential for misunderstanding. He emphasizes the importance of being more specific and historically accurate in our terminology.
Wow, that's a bold suggestion. How has this perspective been received in academic circles?
It sparked quite a bit of debate and reflection. Many scholars are now more cautious about using the term Hermeticism without clear qualifications. There's a growing emphasis on distinguishing between the ancient Hermetic texts and later traditions that claim Hermetic influence.
This sounds like it could have significant implications for how we understand and study these traditions. Are there any other scholars or works you'd recommend for our listeners who want to explore this academic perspective further?
In addition to Hanegraaff's work, I'd highly recommend Christian Bull's The Tradition of Hermēs Trismegistos. Bull provides a detailed examination of the ancient Hermetic tradition and its development over time.
That sounds like a great resource. Is there anything else our listeners should keep in mind as they delve into these academic works?
Yes, it's important to remember that the academic study of Hermeticism is an ongoing process. New discoveries and interpretations are constantly emerging. I'd encourage our listeners to approach these studies with an open mind and a willingness to challenge their preconceptions about what Hermeticism is and isn't.
That's excellent advice, Jake. It seems like the field of Hermetic studies is as dynamic and complex as the tradition itself.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Hermetic Dialogues, the official podcast of the Way of Hermes website. If you are interested in free articles on Hermeticism and related topics or want to study this ancient tradition through our online course, be sure to visit our website at wayofhermes.com.